BSR. Broad Spectrum Radio. Eclectic, peace-oriented radio programming aired on stations around the world and online at BroadSpectrumRadio.com.
Upwave Media. Upwavemedia.com.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Redtown Radio for this special meeting of the minds on Thanksgiving and the stereotypes surrounding Native Americans or American Indians today. This is Brenda Golden, and it is November 22nd, 2016. And again, thank you for joining me. So this is the 2016 edition of Redtown Radio, and first off, I would like to say and offer my prayers to the water protectors at Standing Rock. If you have not been paying attention, then you aren't aware of all the violence and the actions taken by the Morton County Police and the National Guard toward the water protectors lately. There have been instances of water cannons and rubber bullets being shot at the protesters. There was mass hypothermia from the protesters being caught on the bridge on Sunday evening, and the county officers and National Guard just sprayed them with water endlessly in 29-degree weather, which is, of course, below freezing. It gets very cold in North Dakota this time of year. So I say that to remark about the ongoing institutionalized racism towards American Indians that have been going on since the colonizers first stepped on this soil of the continent known as Turtle Island or the North America. Back whenever the colonizers first landed here, of course, they were outnumbered and began making treaties of peace with Indians or Native Americans. I will use both interchangeably during this session, but I grew up with the term American Indian. Nowadays, I identify myself as Muskogee because I am a Muskogee Creek citizen, and I know that many people prefer to use their native or indigenous name, and that's what I choose to do, but I will variate between Native American and American Indian when describing the indigenous people of this continent. So back to the story of institutionalized racism, and that, we know that racism exists against us, but the larger society sometimes still refuses to acknowledge it. Just look at the way the Bundy folks were able to hold a national park for, I believe, 90 days or longer, and they could go in and out and get supplies. They didn't have anybody showering them with water and pelting them with rubber bullets. It's sickening, and it's shameful to this United States that peaceful protesters would be attacked in such a manner, and there is no outcry from the general public. What is wrong with people? So it is acceptable to allow the white privilege to take over not one, but two different national parks and not be attacked. Even some may say they were allowed and given assistance by local police and sheriffs and law enforcement. We, American Indians, Native Americans, know that a form of racism institutionalized in this country's foundations is the reasons why so many things in life are a constant battle. Institutionalized racism is expressed in the practice of educational, social, and political institutions. It's racism by individuals or informal social groups that are governed by behavioral norms that support racist thinking and foment active racism. What that means, folks, is that the treatment or mistreatment and injustice towards a group of people because of who they are has become so ingrained in society that no one thinks anything about it. It is accepted as just everyday occurrences. That's what has happened in the case of Native Americans in the United States. Some of the ways these disparities reflect that racism are regarded wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other things. Sometimes people say that racism doesn't exist, but we know that it does, because it occurs when a certain group is targeted and discriminated against based upon race. And institutionalized racism can go unnoticed, as it is not always explicit, in-your-face, downright hatefulness as such as going on right now against our water protectors. But let's talk about that foundation of racism in the United States government. The Declaration of Independence itself, the one that is celebrated every July 4th here in the United States as the Day of Freedom. That Declaration of Independence that was penned by a so-called forefather has the following language forever stenciled into the document. Excerpt. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Those merciless Indian savages, there in black and white, agreed upon by all the people who signed that declaration and who, furthermore, celebrate that declaration annually, every year, on July 4th. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, the Europeans brought the cruel custom of paying for killings to the American frontier. Europeans had been practicing scalping techniques for hundreds of years, back to Greek and even Roman days of warfare. So they themselves brought the practice of scalping other humans to the American frontier. And in 1703, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was offering $60 for each scalp of a native that was brought in. In 1756, Pennsylvania Governor Morris, in his declaration of war against the Lenape, or otherwise known as the Delaware people, offered 130 pieces of 8, which is a type of coin, for the scalp of every male Indian enemy. If they were above the age of 12 years, it was 130 pieces. For a female Indian woman, they were offered 50 pieces of 8 for their scalp. But the scalp had to be produced as evidence of their being killed. This industry, called the scalp industry, became law in many states in the United States, with varying prices for children, women, and men. The years of 1849 and 1850 were the true boom time. Although the laws stayed on the books until the 1880s, when the industry had pretty much ran its course, the tone had been set. The Europeans introduced scalping to Native Americans. Yet, the stereotype is that in the United States is that Indians are merciless savages and the Europeans are wimpy. We American Indians, Native Americans in the United States, have suffered grave injustice at the hands of this government, not only in the Founding Fathers from the presidential side, but also from the Supreme Court. From the very beginning, the Supreme Court issued what we commonly know as the Marshall Trilogy. From the period of 1823 to 1832, 3 major cases made it to the Supreme Court before Chief John Marshall. You may already be aware of these: Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and Worcester versus Georgia. But these 3 cases are the bedrock of federal Indian law. Johnson v. McIntosh, the very first case in 1823, John Marshall opined that the doctrine of discovery, this was the very first time that the colonizers justified their taking of this land known as the United States under the doctrine of discovery, that they had the divine right to come to another land, and by virtue of discovering it, they were entitled to it. Whoever discovered it first, at that time, there were many nations from across the water that were coming here establishing colonies. It was their manifest destiny, John Marshall said, to discover this barren land and make it their own. Following that, in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the concept of domestic dependent nations was developed, and later tribal sovereignty. From the very beginning, the Supreme Court rulings described the indigenous people of the United States in a variety of demeaning and belittling ways. In 1877, the Supreme Court issued an opinion in Beecher v. Weatherby, where they opined that it is to be presumed that in this matter the U.S. would be governed by such considerations of justice as would control a Christian people in their treatment of an ignorant and dependent race. In 1886, the Choctaw Nation attempted to have a treaty with the United States, forced for them to abide by the treaty. So they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against the Choctaws, saying that the boundaries established between the Choctaw Indians and the United States on this side of the Mississippi River shall remain without alteration until the period at which said nation shall become so civilized and enlightened as to be made citizens of the United States. In other words, the Supreme Court ruled against the Choctaws because they were not citizens and they were not civilized. In 1954, not so long ago, some of you may have even been born then, in Teton Indians versus the United States, the Supreme Court wrote, "Every American schoolboy knows that the savage tribes of this continent were deprived of their ancestral ranges by force, and that, even when the Indians ceded millions of acres by treaty, in return for blankets, food, and trinkets, it was not a sale, but the conqueror's will that deprived them of their land. Now that was in this century, 1954, and since that time, the United States Supreme Court has overwhelmingly ruled against Native American tribes and Native American interests on a consistent basis. So let's talk about some of the ways that institutionalized racism manifests itself against American Indians in the health field. American Indians and Alaska Native people have a lower health status when compared with other Americans. Lower life expectancy and a disproportionate disease exist perhaps because of inadequate education, disproportionate poverty, discrimination in the delivery of health services, and maybe cultural differences. But we do know that American Indians and Alaska Natives continue to die at higher rates than other Americans in many categories, including chronic liver disease and cirrhosis, diabetes mellitus, unintentional injuries, assault, homicide, intentional self-harm, suicide, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. We know that the Indian Health Services, which was established based on treaties in many cases, treaties that stated that the United States would provide health and education and welfare for Indians for as long as the waters flowed. These Indian health services are terribly underfunded. The facilities are crumbling. They're falling apart. In one case recently, raw sewage was leaking into the operating room. Many of these hospitals and clinics are in the middle of nowhere, away from almost anything that would allow them to get up-to-date medical supplies, drugs, pharmaceuticals. So therefore, they cannot adequately treat the native population that they are supposed to be treating. Nor do I think sometimes that they actually care to. Many of you may also be aware that in the 1950s through probably the 1970s, I might be cutting that a little bit short. It might have been even earlier than that. The United States government Indian Health Service instituted a policy of sterilizing Native American girls and women. And by sterilizing, I mean taking them in for a routine procedure such as an appendectomy or tonsillectomy or some other routine surgery, and taking their ovaries or tying their tubes. Some of these children, such as those at Seneca Indian Boarding School, didn't know until they were adults and couldn't get pregnant that they had been sterilized when they were younger. Thousands of Native American women were sterilized under a sanctioned program by the United States. In the area of criminal justice, Native Americans are incarcerated at a rate 38% higher than the national average, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Native American youth are 30% more likely than whites to be referred to juvenile court than to have charges dropped, according to the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. Native American men are incarcerated at 4 times the rate of white men. Native American women are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white women. In the past 5 years alone, the number of Native Americans incarcerated in federal prisons has increased by 27%. One example, such as that in South Dakota, the state with the fourth highest percentage of Native American residents, Native Americans compose 60% of the federal caseload, but only 8.5% of the total population. The rate of aggravated assault among American Indians and Alaska Natives is roughly twice that of the country as a whole. 1 out of 10 American Indians who are 12 years and older become victims of violent crime annually. Native Americans fall victim to violent crime at more than double the rate of all other United States citizens. That's according to a Bureau of Justice statistic report. 88% of violent crime committed against Native American women is carried out by non-Native perpetrators. And finally, under the area of crime and violence, Native Americans are more likely to be killed by police than any other racial group. That's according to the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. And Democracy Now! Just did a fabulous, in-depth report on that same subject that you can find on their website. In the area of education, Native youth post the worst achievement scores and the lowest graduation rates of any student subgroup. Last year, 67% of American Indian students graduated from high school compared to the national average of 80%. Just 13.3% of Native Americans have undergraduate degrees versus 24.4% of the general population, according to the National Indian Education Association. American Indian Alaska Natives attain the lowest level of education of any racial or ethnic group in the United States, again, according to the NIEA. In the area of social justice, according to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, 16% of students at Bureau of Indian Affairs schools in 2011 reported having attempted suicide in the preceding 12 months. About 2% of U.S. children are American Indian Alaska Native, but they represent 8.4% of the children in foster care, according to the National Indian Child Welfare Association. Adolescent American Indians and Alaska Natives have death rates 2 to 5 times the rate of whites in the same age group, according to SAMHSA, resulting from higher levels of suicide and a variety of risky behaviors. Suicide is the second leading cause of death, and 2.5 times the national rate for American Indian youth in the 15 to 24 age group. Those previewed statistics are indication and evidence of the institutionalized racism that American Indians are dealing with every day. Another way that institutionalized racism is perpetuated and accepted in general society against American Indians is the use of mascots. When you have a grinning Indian with red face and one feather sticking up, or you have a depiction of all Indians wearing headdresses, the Fighting Indians, the Redskins, the Cleveland Indians. There are even some called the Savages. But the problem mainly with those kinds of things, besides the stereotypes that mischaracterize our Indian people, is what the opposing team does whenever they have a game or they are in some type of contest. Sometimes they'll burn effigies of Indians, calling them Redskins. Not too long ago here in Coweta, there was a wagon that had a dead Indian on it and something along those lines about scalp the Redskins. They also had a marching band carrying a banner saying they were going to send the Indians back on a second trail of tears. Those kinds of things perpetuate the hate and the stereotypes towards American Indians. The mascots themselves, although sometimes may seem harmless, carry underneath them a very sordid past. And as I said, the harm in the way that the opposing team or even the team themselves call themselves honoring American Indians by dressing up in red face or buckskins and tassels and fringe and headdresses. Does that really honor American Indians? And especially in the case of Redskins. Although official documents don't use the word in this way, a historical association between the use of redskin and the paying of bounties can be made. In 1863, a Winona, Minnesota newspaper, the Daily Republican, printed an announcement. The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every redskin sent to purgatory. This sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth. And we know that type of thing happened across the board in many states because, as I said earlier, the scalping industry was alive and well up until the end of the 1880s. We don't believe for a minute that having young people calling our native people savages and redskins is not only damaging our people, but it's distorting the history of those who accept it. That history has been distorted so often, such as in the movies where we had the white squaw and the big Indian in Peter Pan that only could speak in broken sentences. We had the proud Indian from The Vanishing American and Tonto, who also dressed in buckskin fringe and could never speak in complete sentences. The movies, until recently, have perpetuated the myth of the savage, ignorant Native American Indian. Those stereotypes were compounded over and over by things such as movies where Indians are buffoons and only come up with one feather sticking out of their head and say, how? Where cartoons were made, cartoon books of Buffalo Bill and other types, Davy Crockett, killing and massacring savage Indians. And lately, in the last few years, we've seen pilgrim parties where signs that say, drink like an Indian and party like a pilgrim, have surfaced around the Thanksgiving time. Thanksgiving is known to many as the time whenever the pilgrims were saved by the Indians to help them get through a harsh winter. The Indians took them in and showed them how to survive, and they all had a big meal and sat down and ate together and prayed together and gave thanks together. Some of that has been widely disputed by the fact that they were at war at many times. The scalp industry was going on, and it is known that at that time, one of the governors in Massachusetts, who had just killed a whole village and set them on fire, was known to have called all the settlers together for a big celebration dinner to give thanks for that massacre. So Thanksgiving isn't all that celebratory for American Indians and indigenous people of this continent. Many may not want to celebrate it for the reasons I stated before. It is a day of mourning to many. That was the first instance of history being distorted for the colonizers' use. In 2012, there were an estimated 5.2 million people who call themselves American Indians. While it's difficult to determine how many indigenous people lived in North America before Columbus, estimates range from 7 million to a high of 18 million. The complete eradication of this noble, proud people would and could have occurred, but for the strength and determination of our ancestors, we are still here today. We remain proud and we remain strong, and we must remain vigilant against the ongoing institutionalized racism against our people. Mado.